Good evening. Welcome to Views from the U, the political science of the election of 2024, hosted by the Department of Political Science here at the University of Minnesota. My name is Andy Karch, and I'm the current chair of the department. And whether you're here with us in person in the Coles Auditorium or you're joining us online via Zoom, we are delighted that you are here, and we are looking forward to a great discussion with a very strong group of panelists. So tonight we are officially 1 week away, right? 1 week to go before Election Day. Millions of ballots have already been cast through early voting. And so 5 faculty experts will take us behind the headlines that you're probably following with great energy and tell us what they're tracking. They'll tell us what we should be keeping in mind as this extraordinarily unusual election campaign comes down the final stretch. So before I turn it over to them, let me say a quick word about each of our presenters. Our first presentation will be given by Professor Kathryn Pearson, an expert on the U.S. Congress, congressional elections, and women in politics. And as you can see on the screen, her presentation is entitled U.S. Presidential and Congressional Elections. Our second presentation will be given by Professor Dan Myers, whose research lies at the intersection of political psychology and political communication, with a particular focus on group-based partisan polarization, and his presentation is entitled Partisanship, Elections, and Shifting Party Coalitions. Michael Minta will be giving our third presentation. He is also an expert in congressional politics, as well as interest groups and race and ethnic politics. His presentation is entitled Demographics and Their Impact on the 2024 U.S. Elections. Our fourth presentation will be given by Professor Tim Johnson. Tim is an expert on judicial politics, particularly the Supreme Court, in terms of its decision-making and oral arguments that occur before the court. His presentation is entitled The 2024 Elections and the Federal Judiciary. Our fifth and final presentation will be given by Professor Mark Bell. Mark's research examines issues relating to nuclear proliferation, nuclear weapons, international relations theory, and U.S. and British foreign policy, and his presentation is entitled Foreign Policy and the 2024 Election. And so as you can see, we're going to be covering a lot of different facets of the current campaign. Each of our presenters will give a presentation that is about 10 minutes long. I'll let them know when they have 2 minutes left. And then once the presentations are complete, I'll moderate a discussion during which our panelists will respond to questions from our audience. So we've already collected a great group of questions in advance when people registered for the event, and they submitted a number of really interesting queries. And we're also going to collect questions here in the auditorium in real time. So for our in-person audience, please write your index cards, please write your questions on the index cards that you received when you came into the auditorium. Once you've filled out the card, please pass it to the aisle, and our outstanding staff of the Political Science Department will collect those cards and pass them along to me. So we'll be collecting those cards after the second, fourth, and fifth presentation. So after presentations by Dan Myers, Tim Johnson, and Mark Bell. But regardless, we'll make sure that your questions make their way up to the stage. So now that we've established our ground rules, it gives me great pleasure to turn the floor over to my distinguished colleagues. And so we'll begin with Professor Kathryn Pearson. Kathryn, take it away.
Thank you so much. So as Professor Karch said, we are a week out from Election Day. But if you're in this room or watching us online, surely you already know that. And you likely already know that this election is a toss-up. It is very, very close. And it is close and being waged in 7 swing states in 1 congressional district. And so I want to talk about the Electoral College and provide some insight into why we are talking about 7 swing states instead of 50 states plus the District of Columbia. The founders created what has come to be known as the Electoral College in an effort to mix state, congressional, and popular participation in the presidential selection process. As stipulated in Article 2 of the Constitution, the number of electoral votes in each state equals its total number of representatives in Congress, that is, its members of the House, plus its U.S. senators. the Constitution left it to states to choose electors who would then deliberate and choose a trusted candidate. The founders had a distrust of the public and its capacity to make these decisions in a popular vote, thus the Electoral College. So today, we are left with the constitutional framework that has important consequences in presidential elections. We only need to look back to the 2016 elections, where Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by nearly 3 million votes and lost the Electoral College vote. So this map on the screen shows the number of electors by state and the 2000 Electoral College results. Minnesota has 10, a product of our 8 representatives and 2 senators, and no state, however small its population, has fewer than 3 Electoral College votes. Big states are actually underrepresented in the Electoral College because of Senate malapportionment. So a voter in California, for example, has 1 elector for every 617,000 residents, while a voter in Wyoming has 1 elector for every 165,000 residents. Of course, to win, a candidate needs 270 out of 538 electoral votes. If it's a 269-269 tie, the decision goes to the House of Representatives. But each member of the House of Representatives doesn't get a vote. Instead, each state gets a vote. So each congressional delegation must choose which candidate wins that state. So as you can imagine, they could use any number of decision rules. Who won the popular vote in that state? How many members are of each party in that state? So Minnesota has a 4-4 House delegation. You can see that this could cause many complications. Currently, Republican delegations outnumber Democratic delegations, and that's not likely to change after the 2024 elections. I suspect if we actually got to a 269-269 tie, we would see some court challenges, but if you ever sort of play the Electoral College game on 270towin.com, you can see there are different pathways that would actually get us to 269, but don't think too hard about that. It is also the case in that scenario that according to the Constitution, the Senate would decide the vice president. So you can imagine a very interesting scenario where the House and the Senate choose candidates of different parties. Again, I think there'd be some constitutional challenges there. Hopefully, we will not find out. So the result of the Electoral College is that American presidential elections are not decided directly by the national popular vote, and 48 of our 50 states cast all of their electoral votes for the candidate who receives the most popular votes in that state, even by a razor-thin margin. Only Maine and Nebraska allocate their electoral votes based on congressional districts, plus the statewide vote going to the 2 Senate electors. It also has important implications for candidates in the campaigns. Candidates spend way more time and way more money in swing states. All you have to do is watch the news and you're likely to see that Harris or Trump or Walz or Vance, they're in Georgia, they're in North Carolina, they're in Michigan, Wisconsin, Nevada, Arizona. They're in the key swing states, and unless they're raising money, they're not spending a lot of time in other states. It is also the case that voters are getting much more attention in key swing states, and political science research has actually found that among lower income voters, voters in swing states are more knowledgeable than voters in other states. Definitely the Electoral College affects candidate strategies, outcomes, and voters' experiences. If you're reading the polls, then this is not a poll that you want to see. It's not that helpful. A lead in the popular vote does not tell us who will be president. Due to sort of the distribution in votes in states, Democrats need to win the popular vote by, it varies from cycle to cycle, but at least a couple of percentage points in order to win the Electoral College vote. So this particular New York Times poll from yesterday, it's a polling average, is not very helpful because it's the national vote. Now, here are the 7 swing states plus 1 congressional district in Nebraska that people are paying attention to because this is where the presidential election will be won or lost. And as you can see, all of these 7 swing states are very close within the margin of error, which is why I started by saying this race is sort of as close as a coin flip. However, there are ways that political scientists think about who will win an election before the campaign even starts. Political scientists refer to these as the fundamentals. And there's actually a debate among political scientists about whether or not campaigns even matter, which, as someone who, teaches campaigns and elections, seems a little nuts. Obviously, campaigns are very significant, but it is also the case that the media perhaps overemphasizes all of the gaffes, all of the day-to-day, which really may not have that much of an impact on an election. So what are the fundamentals? What do political scientists use in their models that project election outcomes well before the campaign starts? Well, first of all, which party is the incumbent party and how long has that party been in office? Of course, Democrats are the incumbent party, Biden's the incumbent president, but this is his first term. Of course, he is not actually on the ballot, but nonetheless, elections are a referendum on the incumbent party, and the current vice president is the nominee. Now, Biden's popularity ratings average around 39%, and so when those are thrown into the model, it does not look particularly good for Democrats. Harris's approval ratings average around 47%, Trump's around 44%. What about the state of the nation? First of all, what is the state of the economy? Different metrics of the economy are used in different models, but certainly, growth in GDP matters, but so does the legacy of inflation. And as Professor Myers will talk extensively about, our views of the economy and things that you think should be objectively measured actually are very much biased by our partisan identification going in. But in terms of the models, what's the state of the nation? And then, of course, the partisan identification of the electorate. We are a narrowly and relatively evenly divided nation. If you look at any polls that suggest that we're about a third Republican, a third Democrat, and a third independent, just know that they do not include independent leaners with the partisans, and they should. We're actually relatively evenly divided. There aren't that many pure independents, only about 10 to 12%. And so there aren't that many swing voters out there. The media would have you believe that there are probably more than they are. So the fundamentals, political scientists use these fundamentals in various models to predict the outcomes before the campaign really got going over the summer. 4 out of the 7 models predicted a Trump win. 3 of them predicted a Democratic win. So as you can see, it's a very close election, which means that campaigns really matter, because when they're only swing states and they're all within the margin of error, these campaign effects can make a particularly important difference, whether that's mobilizing voters or sort of the latest gaffe on the campaign trail. It is worth noting that another reason that political scientists say that campaigns often don't matter is because the campaigns are usually relatively similar. They usually raise a similar amount of money, pursue similar strategies. We don't see that here. Harris has massively outraised Trump. She has raised over $1 billion to Trump's $381.5 million. So that's a pretty big difference. Plus, independent groups are spending heavily on both. So a very close, evenly divided presidential election. What about U.S. Senate elections? Well, Democrats currently hold 51 seats, and 34 seats are up in 2024, but Democrats have a huge structural disadvantage. 23 of those Senate seats that are up are held by Democrats, and if you think back to 6 years ago, it was the 2018 midterms, which was an extremely favorable context for Democrats. And so now many of those candidates who won, particularly those candidates who won in red states, I'm thinking of Sherrod Brown in Ohio, Tester in Montana, they're now facing really tough re-election races. And so I think that it is unlikely that Democrats will hold on to the Senate. I think it's pretty likely that it will flip, although anything can happen and no one should, place any bets on my predictions. Okay, what about the House of Representatives? Well, Republicans currently hold a 4-seat majority, and as with every congressional cycle, the vast majority of seats are not competitive. There are only 24 out of 435 competitive House races, just as in 2022, 95% of House incumbents were reelected. And when I first started teaching congressional elections and studying congressional elections, it was all about the incumbency advantage, the name recognition, the things that incumbents are able to do in office. And those things are still true, but it is also the case that the vast majority of House districts are represented by incumbents who favor the party whose voters populate that district. In other words, there just aren't that many swing districts, and there aren't that many districts where the residents vote for one party's candidate for president and the other party's candidate for Congress. In both Senate and House elections, split ticket voting, president and congressional races, is at an all-time low. And so I don't expect to see a lot of split ticket voting in 2024, which is why the Democratic candidates running in red states for Senate are so vulnerable, but this does give Democrats the potential to retake the majority in the House. So it is possible that we could be looking at a switch in both chambers after the 2024 elections. And that is it for me. Thank you.
All right, thank you everyone for coming. So I'm going to talk today about partisanship, and what I'm going to try to convince you is that despite all the sort of tumult and chaos that seems to dominate elections, there's a remarkable amount of stability, almost a frightening amount of stability in how elections actually turn out in Americans' political behavior. Okay. And that stability is based in partisanship, or sometimes political scientists say partisan identification. What we mean by that is a psychological tie that people feel to one of the two parties, or sometimes, and maybe even more frequently, an aversion to one of the two parties. And most Americans have this kind of psychological tie, either with a party or against a party. Like Professor Pearson said, there are very few true independents out there. Most people lean one direction or the other. And because they have this psychological tie with one of the two parties or aversion to the other party, every piece of political information that voters get is filtered through this partisan lens. Okay? So if you're a Democrat or if you're an independent who leans towards Democrats and really doesn't like the Republicans, all of the stream of information that comes in during a campaign is filtered through your partisanship. You sort of see it through blue-tinged glasses or red-tinged glasses if you're a Republican. And I like to illustrate the power of partisanship using these two guys. Okay, so folks might remember this picture, a little deep cut at this point. So these are two Republicans, right? But it's hard to imagine two Republicans who are more different than these two Republicans. That seems fair. Okay? But they were also both, not just Republicans, but Republican presidential nominees. And they were Republican presidential nominees in succeeding years. We got Romney in 2012 and then Trump in 2016. And so again, it's hard to think of two Republicans more distant from each other than Mitt Romney and Donald Trump. What I want everyone to think about now, get a number in your head, what percentage of people who voted for Romney in 2012 voted for Trump in 2016? So just fix a number in your head. Okay. And the answer is almost all of them. Okay, so about 90% of Republicans, a little under 90%, 84% of Romney voters went on to vote for Trump in 2016. So even with this sort of massive shift in the character of the Republican Party, most Republicans stuck with their party. But the same is true for the Democrats. We see almost no shifts between 2012 Obama voters and 2016 Clinton voters. And the same thing happens even to a greater degree in 2016 and 2020. So if you think about everything that happened in 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020, how often a single day seemed like a whole year, and yet nothing really changed. And so this is the power of partisanship right here. All of that happened, and yet these psychological attachments which produce this partisan lens create a great deal of stability in how individuals act politically. Okay. But we do see some changes election cycle to election cycle. And I want to talk about that in terms of another way of thinking about political parties, not partisanship, but partisan coalitions. And in particular, shifts in party coalitions. So I want to illustrate this using the Minnesota DFL, and not just because Minnesotans really like Minnesota, but because Minnesota's DFL has the coalition, the list of social groups that make up this party right there in the name. They are the Democrats, the farmers, and the laborers. Right? And so attachment to the DFL party often comes through one of these groups that makes up the Democratic coalition. So you can think of a lot of different identities that people might have that go into either the Democratic coalition or the Republican coalition. And as recently as 2012, you can see the DFL coalition in voting behavior. So what we're looking at here is the vote DFL or Republican for state Senate candidates in 2012. And you can see we got the farmers, we got the laborers, and then we got the Democrats in the urban core. Okay, so that was the DFL coalition really up until 2012, and then 2016 happened. and 2020. And even this is a little misleading because those two blue districts up in the Iron Range, those state senators left the DFL soon after the 2020 election. They said, we're independents now. Okay. So what happened? What happened despite the great deal of individual stability between these elections to cause this massive shift in how people voted, at least in a geographic sense? So I think we can tell this story using 2 yard signs that were in my old neighborhood. Okay, so I lived in Minneapolis. It was one of the most blue parts of Minneapolis, and you would walk around my neighborhood and you would see a lot of these signs. Folks are familiar with these signs probably, okay? And there was one guy before 2016 who had this sign in his yard, okay? But he moved away. So if you think about parties as coalitions of groups and partisan identities as coming from the identities that people bring from non-political realms to politics, you can see why it would be hard for these two groups to exist in the same party. And eventually something gives. And so those shifts, which in the aggregate might be very small, but are durable and lasting, and thus can be extremely consequential. Okay. And this is the story of shifts from 2012 to 2016 and then to 2020. We see the shift of non-college educated white voters out of the Democratic camp into the Republican camp. Meanwhile, college educated Democrats, and so geographically this shows up particularly in the suburbs, shifting into the Democratic camp. All right, so that's the change from 2016 to 2020. What do we see in 2024, at least in current polling, which of course can change. Okay, so our long-term trend, again, is this educational polarization. So previously, whether or not you had a college degree was not a very good predictor of how you would vote. After 2016, it becomes a pretty good predictor of how you're going to vote. And so college-educated voters, particularly white college-educated voters, shift towards the Democrats. Non-college educated voters, particularly white non-college educated voters, shift towards the Republicans. In 2024, that may have stopped. We may be at the level of education polarization that we're going to be at. We see instead two other trends emerging, differences between 2020 and 2024. Okay? And so one is gender polarization. So there's always been a gender gap between the two parties recently. There appears to be an even bigger one in this election than there was in the past. We also see some evidence of racial depolarization. And so what we mean by this is the Democrats losing their edge with non-white voters, particularly male non-white voters. And just to be clear, the vast majority of black voters, the majority of Hispanic and Asian voters are probably still going to vote for the Democrats, but it's probably going to be a smaller majority than it was in previous elections, at least if the current polling is correct. So these are the trends, the long-term, and then maybe what we're seeing in this election, shifts in the partisan coalitions. And so it's easy to get caught up in sort of who's going to win this state or that state, who's going to win this Senate seat or that Senate seat. But when we think about the parties and what makes up each of the two parties, these are the kind of trends that we want to look at, that we want to see, pay attention to as we're trying to tell what do each of these parties stand for, what groups do they represent, and then how might we expect that to play out across geography. Okay, I'm going to end on a little bit of a local note. I'm going to talk about a couple of state house seats. Who's excited about the Minnesota State House elections? All right. Okay, so these are seats that I'm looking for, partially because they're really important to determine who's going to control the state house, but partially because they're going to tell us a lot about these shifts and which of these shifts is playing out. Okay. So, State House 62B. This is not a swing district. This is actually the most Democratic district in Minnesota, but it's also the most racially diverse district. So the Democratic candidate won 90.3% of the vote in the last State House election. I'd expect that to come down, but it will be really interesting to see how much that comes down. This is 32B. This is in Blaine. This is the suburbs. This should be a swing district. In fact, the Republican candidate for state auditor won a majority of votes in this district. Will the suburban swing to the Democrats continue? If so, we would expect the Democrats to win pretty comfortably here. The next two districts are in State Senate District 3. Okay, these are State House Districts 3A and 3B in the Iron Range. 3A in particular has the Democratic or DFL mayor of International Falls running against the Republican but former Democrat until Trump mayor of Ely. And so is the Iron Range continuing to shift red? And then finally, these two districts in Afton and Cottage Grove, these were the site of the most closely contested state Senate race in 2022. The Democratic candidate won by about 300 votes. These are probably the suburban districts that are going to decide who's going to control the State House. Okay, so thanks, everyone.
Let's see, how do we start the timer? I'll just do it on watch. You got it? Okay, all right. Hello, everyone. Let me move this up just a little bit. Okay, thanks for coming. I know that many of you guys probably want us to tell you who's going to win the election. We don't know. Every time I watch these panels on CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, whatever, I think, oh, they're going to give us some insight, and there's usually, but it's exciting right now, right? Think about this before I get into my presentation. I mean, we got history that may happen, right? We may have the first Black South Asian woman who could be president of the United States. You could have, if the Democrats win the House, U.S. House of Representatives, the first Black Speaker of the House. And here in Minnesota, of course, if the football coach becomes vice president, then we'll have the first Native American being governor of the state of Minnesota. So these are, if you study kind of like politics, I mean, these are some very interesting times that we're living in. And so Tuesday night is going to be very, very exciting and probably sad for some people too. Happy. Anyway, so I wanted to talk just a little bit about the changing demographics of and what they mean for electoral competition, and what does the change, you've heard like demographics, it's destiny, and what does that mean for Democrats or Republicans? Is one party advantaged more than the other in terms of these changes, and what does these challenges, what does it mean in terms of facing a country with a more diverse electorate? And then what are the implications for representative democracy? Try to go through it fast. So what are the purpose of elections? They're kind of like the bedrock of our representative democracy. One, we select our leaders. We want to they help hold our leaders accountable. If they're not doing what we want them to do, we can throw the bums out. Prevent tyranny of the minority, provide responsiveness to their constituents. They provide legitimacy. We think that our elected officials usually have more legitimacy because they're from the people and they were selected by the people than non-elected officials. And obviously to make policy making. Now the electorate has expanded over time. So it's like, well, this is not new news, but in the founding of the country, it was mostly white men with property that had the right to vote. Then the franchise was extended later to Black men with the 15th Amendment after the Civil War, women in 1920 with the 19th Amendment, and then 18-year-olds who were added to the electorate because of if they could fight in a war, surely they should have the right to vote. Let me give a quick shout out. University of Minnesota students, we have like this, they keep track of who votes in national elections, and usually our students have in the Big Ten, is it really the Big Ten now? Yeah, the Big Ten, we usually win that. We have the highest voting rate of all the students in the Big Ten, so hopefully we can keep that up for this cycle. So, yeah. But what's changing now is the demographics of the electorate over time. So you can see the fastest growing groups, Latinos, Asian Americans, Blacks, and then you can see about 76% of the electorate are mostly non-white. So our electorate is getting much more diverse. And then you can see this is, I'll skip through this, but this is basically showing how the electorate has changed, like in terms of party identification, which Dan Myers was talking about recently, where both, not only is the electorate in terms of people who are identifying with the parties getting more diverse, you can actually see all the parties, despite what people believe, are actually getting more diverse. Even the Republican Party is getting more diverse, but most of the racial and ethnic diversity is occurring within the Democratic Party. Here's a snapshot of how that translates in some of the battleground states that we see, although Florida's kind of moving out of that battleground range here. But you can see the proportion of whites is slowly declining as a proportion of the overall electorate in these states. And you can see where some of these states house many of these demographic groups. So for blacks, you can see mostly in the southern states. And that, I mean, that's one reason why Georgia all of a sudden is becoming a swing state. Latinos so this is Asian Americans, and also in Georgia, I mean, many stories were saying how Georgia was fairly competitive because of the rise of the Asian American population. In the Southwest, Latinos are becoming a bigger part of the electorate. And so I pose this as a question, but I'm going to answer my question. Democrats are really hoping with Joe Biden stepping down and Kamala Harris taking over, that she can replicate what Obama did in 2008 and 2012. Wow, and if you kind of look at all the different groups, I mean, many of these demographic groups, blacks voted at a much higher rate, actually in terms of proportion, at a higher rate than whites in 2008, well, over 60%, and then in 2012. So they're very high numbers. So they're hoping that Harris can replicate that in 2024. So what do these changes mean for Democrats and Republicans? So if the trends hold up, and if the country's getting more diverse, then you can see that the vast majority, over time, whites usually cast their votes for Republican candidates, but for Latinos, blacks, and Asian Americans, they usually vote overwhelmingly for the Democratic Party. So again, these are the implications that if these trends continue, and then Dan mentioned about the differences in terms of race, by gender, by race and ethnicity and gender. So you can see there are some differences between men and women, where white men are solidly voting Republicans and white women, still the majority are voting Republican, but it's a lot closer in terms of how their vote for Republicans and Democrats. We'll go through that quick. Can Democrats rely on this? So the country's becoming more diverse, but can Democrats rely on this coalition to win elections consistently? Well, most of the data shows that whites still vote more consistently than black, Latinos, and Asian Americans. So again, it's how much can Democrats get these groups to come out to vote? Let's go through here. How much time? How am I doing on time? 2 minutes, okay. So what are some of these challenges in terms of governing an increasingly diverse nation? You have the white backlash. Donald Trump, in a lot of ways, is a response to the election of Barack Obama in 2008. And the consolidation of trying to say this is a party that whites are losing to these non-white groups. And so Trump it's a strategy that they're using, and it's causing a lot of division, and people are becoming more polarized before that. You know, anxieties, political psychology, like his anxiety, people like Kamala Harris. I mean, we see ads about Ilhan Omar in the Iron Range, and she's the representative here. So, I mean, again, these fear, this anger that's motivating people to go to one side. But I wanted to say one thing before we leave. So I think one of the biggest challenge to democracy in terms of worrying, if people say diversity is a challenge, or if they say white backlash is a challenge, is elections, and can we use them? Remember I showed this slide. Can we use them as a tool of accountability and representing the voice of people? And I think there's some things that we should really worry about. So, skip that. One, only a small proportion of the population contributes to federal elections. And again, and the Federal Election Commission keeps information on people who make at least $200 or more, and they register that information. And so according to OpenSecrets.org, only 0.87% of the United States population contributed more than $200 or more. And that accounted for 78% of all the contributions to federal elections. So again, if we want elections to really be the voice of people and the voice of democracy, I mean, we really have to look at ways to, I just want to throw this plug in, thinking about who's really being represented in elections. Quick conclusion. So as the country becomes more diverse, Blacks, Latinos, Asian Americans, and college-educated whites will make a big determination on who's going to win these federal elections, whether it's the presidency, whether it's United States Congress. It has made our government institutions more diverse racially and ethnically, particularly the House. But we do have some challenges when it comes to this in terms of there are some, I didn't go over this, but the restrictive voting measures may limit minority participation in elections, white backlash, the rise of white reactionary groups, rise of Donald Trump, and Trumpism, and that's all I have. Thank you.
If you have any questions so far, you can just pass them to the aisles. We'll come down to the.
All right, so I will switch gears and talk about an institution that conventional wisdom suggests has not had effects on elections, although we know that the court and the judiciary probably had some effect on the election, obviously as far back as the 2000 election, although whether or not it had a real effect is in question. But certainly the court had an effect in terms of who people were thinking about for whom to vote in 2016 and 2020, and it's pretty certain that the court is going to have an effect on the election that's going to happen next week. And so I really want to answer two questions tonight. The first is the idea of what impact the Supreme Court might have on the election, and then the impact that the election might have on the Supreme Court. So let me get to that first question in terms of the Supreme Court's impact on the election. And I will note first to you that the court has already had an impact on the election in a number of ways. And the first way that the court has tried to maybe not influence the election, but stay out of the election, which in and of itself has an impact, is that the court has docketed almost no controversial cases for its 2024 term. Of course, the justices already heard oral argument in the ghost guns case and have set oral argument for the gender-affirming care case for after the election in December. As a total, the court has only docketed 47 cases for full dress argument for this term, which is well below its average. And I suspect that that is the justices thinking that they're going to have to absolutely docket some or possibly docket some election-related cases after November 5th. But time will tell whether or not that is the case. And so by the justices really pulling back and not deciding controversial cases and saving that room, they're trying to not impact the election. But that may have an indirect effect. We know the justices really were worried in some respect that they had changed the results of the 2022 election because of what happened in the Dobbs decision, not only with the leak in May of 22, but the ultimate decision coming down in June of 2022, and the red wave that folks thought would happen in that midterm ultimately did not happen. But the court has already been involved in the election twice already, not this term. The court ruled last term in Colorado that states may not use the insurrection clause of the 14th Amendment to keep presidential candidates off of their ballots. And in August, it ruled that Arizona absolutely is allowed to require proof of citizenship when people are registering to vote.
You will also note, and I will not go through the exact cases until Q&A if you'd like to hear more, but you will note that there are cases teed up for the court to decide, and the court decided 2 election-related cases just this afternoon, one about an hour and a half ago. There are 3 cases out of Pennsylvania. There are the cases that may emanate from North Carolina with issues surrounding Hurricane Helene, dealing with lost mail-in ballots, voter IDs that may have been lost, although that state seems fine so far. North Carolina has another issue of trying to cut 200,000 voters from its rolls. There is an issue in Georgia. There's a case out of the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals that was just decided yesterday about mail-in ballots. We can have more discussion about that if you would like. Virginia is currently at the U.S. Supreme Court asking the court to be able to allow it to purge 1,600 voters that it thinks are not actually eligible to vote. The response brief was due today at 4 p.m. Eastern or 3 p.m. our time here in Minnesota. That response brief I read before coming here this evening and was a very strong case for the U.S. government, saying that those voters should be allowed to vote. And then finally, there are the RFK Jr. cases, and I can tell you that is the case that was just decided about an hour and a half ago, and the decision was that the justices would not get involved in those cases, emanating out of Wisconsin and Michigan, and I can say with a high degree of certainty that RFK's time at the Supreme Court is over. That said, the Wisconsin case was decided unanimously. In other words, there were no dissents among the justices for the decision not to take the case. Justice Neil Gorsuch, on the other hand, did publicly dissent in the Michigan case, and all he did in his dissent was point to a dissent out of the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals and said, I dissent based on that dissent. And the argument was not an ideological one. It was that Michigan was asked in a timely manner by the RFK Jr. campaign to remove his name from the ballot. The ballot, in fact, had not even been printed when he made that request. And therefore, it was done in such a timely manner that his name should have been removed. Michigan went ahead, put his name on the ballot nonetheless, but his case is over with. So we can get into specifics of those cases if you would like to during the Q&A session. And that gets to the next question that I have, and that is, what effect might the election have on the Supreme Court and the federal judiciary more generally? And there's a number of ways that there may be an impact. The first is which party wins the House. And of course, if the Democrats win the House, you can expect a vast array of hearings and investigations into ethics issues at the U.S. Supreme Court, as well as hearings on reforms for the U.S. Supreme Court and for the judiciary more generally. The other question has to do with who wins the Senate and who wins the White House. And the first key to that question is the age of justices on the U.S. Supreme Court. Justices Alito and Thomas will be 75 and 77 respectively at the end of this term, and Justice Sonia Sotomayor will be 71 by the end of this term. So what happens depending on who wins the White House? So let's assume that there is a split between the White House and the Senate. I think that at that point there will probably be no vacancies on the U.S. Supreme Court, or at least vacancies that could be helped. Obviously, one cannot help themselves if they ultimately die. What I will say this is that if there is a split, the reason I say that there will probably be no movement is that Senators Cornyn and Thune have said that if one of them, which are the most likely to become majority leader if the Republicans do indeed take the Senate, have not committed to confirming any nominees that would emanate out of a Harris White House. Now, the Democrats may act the same if Harris were to win the election and the Republicans would take the House. The difference is that the Democrats really tie themselves to liking norms and liking rules. And while I suspect that they would like to take revenge for Merrick Garland in particular and for the RBG issue that happened just before the 2020 election, I think the Democrats are less likely to gain that revenge than the Republicans would be to say we will sit for up to 3 years or the entire 4 years with only 8 justices on the Supreme Court. But what happens if President Trump wins and the GOP takes the Senate? I suspect that there will be massive pressure, and that's a technical term, on Justice Sotomayor to resign as soon as possible, meaning the day after the election is called, whether that's November 6th or November 17th, and that pressure from the Democratic Party and the White House in particular will be daily, hourly, by the minute, probably by the second. If Trump wins and the GOP wins the Senate, you can probably be assured that President Trump will have at a minimum 2 nominees to the U.S. Supreme Court. I would suspect that Justice Thomas, even though he has promised to stay on the bench until 2031, that would be his 40 years, would consider retiring for someone much younger, and Justice Alito would be the same. And this would put President Trump in rarefied territory. Only Eisenhower, FDR, Presidents Taft, Grant, Lincoln, Jackson, and Washington have put a majority of justices on the U.S. Supreme Court. FDR put on 9. Obviously, Washington put on all of the justices because it was brand new. That wasn't 9, it was only 6 at the time. But Trump would be in that rarefied air. My final point is on this issue is that if Harris wins and the GOP takes the Senate, I would also expect that Sotomayor will be asked to retire and the pressure will be there. My final point is about the impact of this election on the federal judiciary well beyond the U.S. Supreme Court. Note as of this morning, there were 44 lower court vacancies, either in the federal circuits or the federal district courts, and 23 announced retirements where those vacancies are not yet technically open. There are only 15 pending nominations. The Biden administration has sort of dropped the ball at this point during the campaign season on nominations to the federal bench. The election could tip the 3rd, the 4th, and the 11th circuits, depending on who wins the election. Note that currently the Democrats have a majority on 7 of the circuit courts of appeals, and the Republicans have a majority in 6. 370 of our current district court or trial court judges were nominated and confirmed by Democratic majorities, and Republicans hold 267 of those seats. And so again, we think of the 9, but there can be incredible repercussions in the lower courts as well, and there have already been repercussions in particular in the 5th Circuit and the Northern District of Texas, and then the 5th Circuit more generally. And so the question at the end of this, although it's not letting me advance the slides again, let me see if I can do so here. There we go. Is that they're easy conclusions. The Supreme Court is going to have something to do with how this election is decided because it already has. The question will be how many cases the justices are willing to take. I don't think they've got a great penchant for wanting to take those cases, but they certainly have the votes to do so if they would like. And finally, the election is going to have a major impact on not only the U.S. Supreme Court, but the entire federal judiciary, and that makes the federal judiciary a key election issue next Tuesday. Thank you all very much.
Great, so I'm going to wrap up the panel by talking about foreign policy and the 2024 election, both in terms of the effect that foreign policy may have on the 2024 election and the consequences of the 2024 election for foreign policy. And this is an area where what political scientists sort of think about this issue is actively sort of in flux. So I'm going to give you the kind of traditional view, and then I'm going to tell you why the traditional view is no longer what most people think and give a sort of more updated view. So the traditional view is that it's sort of 4 basic points. First, that foreign policy doesn't generally matter much to individuals' vote choices, that when you look down the list of issues that Americans vote on, foreign policy issues tend to be fairly low. Other issues are much more salient when Americans are making their choice of who to vote for. Secondly, to the extent that mass publics and the electorate have views about foreign policy, the traditional view of political scientists has been, yeah, they have certain views, but those views are often somewhat incoherent. That what they think about issue 1 is not necessarily consistent with what they think about foreign policy issue 2. And they often also follow the cues of political elites, right? So if you're a Republican and you support Ronald Reagan, say, you support Ronald Reagan's foreign policy, right? Not because you particularly thought about the foreign policy issues per se, but because you support Reagan, right? So that was a second big component of the sort of traditional view of how these issues play out. Third, when it comes to the consequences of elections, we tended to think there was a lot of overlap between Republican and Democratic presidents when it came to foreign policy. Right? Which is not to say there weren't differences between Republican and Democratic administrations, but there were a substantial number of core issues about which there was a sort of bipartisan agreement. You can think about issues relating to trade, nuclear non-proliferation, US alliances, and so on. Fourth, that presidents are substantially constrained in their ability to radically shift the sort of ship of state of the United States. They're constrained by Congress, right, which has all sorts of constitutionally authorized powers in the realm of foreign policy, power of the purse, power to conduct impeachments, power to declare war, and so on. The federal bureaucracy, Defense Department, the military, intelligence agencies, and so on. So this view basically leads to a sort of conclusion that foreign policy is not particularly significant, either as a cause of what happens in elections, nor is foreign policy a major consequence of elections. The issue, though, is that I think this view is basically charitably increasingly misleading and more accurately just flat out wrong. And I think it's become increasingly unviable over time. So here's, I think, a more sort of accurate view of the role that foreign policy may be playing today. First, and so I'll talk briefly about each of these sort of components of the kind of traditional view. First, it's true that specific foreign policy issues are often not a priority of voters, right? But what voters do seem to care about is attributes that they think matter on the world stage, and particularly strength of various forms, right? So a sort of historical example that you could interpret in this way, right? When Kennedy runs for president and he rails against the missile gap with the Soviet Union, right? This missile gap that turned out not to be there, was fictional, right? But what Kennedy, this view would say, was trying to do there is not that he was appealing to some set of voters for whom missiles was the key electoral issue that they were voting on. He was generally trying to project a sort of aura of strength. And there is a lot more evidence that even if they don't care about particular issues, they do care a lot about this general sort of aura that presidential candidates give off. Okay, the computer's saying the battery's about to run out, so hopefully I will speed up. Second, it turns out that publics, in fact, don't have particularly incoherent views about foreign policy. They actually have quite coherent views about US foreign policy. But the complication here is that there is a tension between the policies they support in and of themselves in terms of the policies and this strength that they generally like to see projected. Right? So actually, often you see candidates who are taking more hawkish positions on certain issues than the electorate actually wants, in terms of if you ask for polling on those specific issues, but the public do want the strength that they think those hawkish positions tend to project. And so there's this sort of interesting tension that candidates have to try to navigate. Third, this idea that there are not major foreign policy consequences to presidential elections, I think is just untrue at this point in time. I think you've seen both polarization in terms of the parties moving further away from each other and partisan shifts, particularly on the Republican side and particularly associated with Donald Trump, that mean we now have those kind of core issues on which there had previously been a certain amount of bipartisan agreement has simply fallen apart. So if you look at issues to do with trade, US alliances, approaches to nuclear proliferation, approaches to key relationships internationally, whether that's Russia, Iran, China, Israel, Mexico, North Korea. Now you see radically different approaches from the two parties and a greater gap in terms of the foreign policy consequences of an election than I think any time in recent history. Second, the idea that presidents are constrained, I think, is also becoming increasingly unviable. I think presidents, in fact, the evidence would suggest, are increasingly unconstrained with respect to foreign policy. I think over time you've seen a consistent and increasing congressional abdication of its constitutional authorities, right? And this goes back a long way, right? I mean, the United States Congress hasn't declared war since World War II, right? Clearly, the United States has been at war many times since then, right? But also in terms of the oversight that Congress provides on the foreign policy making, in terms of the amount of congressional expertise on foreign policy, you've seen a general decline in Congress's ability to constrain the presidency. Within the executive branch, you've also seen a considerable concentration of power within the White House. And this has particularly involved the bureaucratization and the building up of the National Security Council basically as a tool of the presidency and as a way to control what were previously much more independent institutions in terms of the Department of Defense, Department of State, and so on. You've seen greater use of what we might term workarounds of various institutional constraints. For example, the use of acting appointments as a way of avoiding Senate approval of cabinet appointees, the use of executive agreements rather than treaties in making agreements with countries to avoid having to send, to avoid having to send things to the Senate. And then finally, I'll just mention and I'll defer to Tim on this, the Supreme Court immunity decision, right, which at least on its face, and obviously we have yet to see how the sort of jurisprudence of this plays out over time, but at least on the face of it seems to place a significant, or remove a significant tool of potential, at least, institutional constraint on the presidency, to the extent that foreign policy making is squarely within the sort of official capacities of the president. And so I was going to wrap up there anyway, so I will stop there.
All right. Well, thank you, Mark. Thanks to all of you for a great set of presentations, very intriguing and engaging. We've already got a great group of questions, and so I'm going to draw on them right away, and I'm going to direct these questions to Dan and to Kathryn to start off. And so we have a couple of different questions. One member of the audience is intrigued by this account of gender polarization, and so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about where that's coming from and whether you think it will be an enduring feature of American politics. And then a second, also related to sort of the moment we're at in the campaign, you know, a lot of money is being spent on campaign advertisements. And so what does the political science research show about the potential impact of this spending, particularly last-minute spending, as candidates make their last plea for different voters in these swing states?
Great. Thank you all, and what great questions. So thinking about the gender gap, it first emerged in 1980, and there's a specific political science definition for the gender gap, which is actually different than you see in the media. The media like to sort of add different directions together and give you this big gender gap, but the political science definition of the gender gap is the difference in support between men and women for the same candidate. So, for example, in 2020, women supported Biden 11% more than men supported Biden. And so that is the gender gap. Now, that has been in place since 1980, and it is consistent across sort of racial subgroups. So, for example, among Black Americans who overwhelmingly support Democratic candidates, nonetheless, Black women still support Democratic candidates at a higher rate than Black men. Same thing is true with Latinas, Asian Americans, et cetera. What we are seeing in this campaign is a pretty typical sort of difference in that women are supporting Harris to a much greater extent than they are Trump, but the gender gap looks a little bit different because men are supporting Trump to a greater extent than they did 4 years ago. And so this dynamic on the campaign trail is very interesting. You know, back in 1996, someone coined soccer moms, and then there were all sorts of different suburban moms for a long time. But now we're not thankfully, talking about suburban moms, because of course suburban moms are actually a very diverse group, and it's sort of silly to talk about suburban moms. We are talking about men. We're talking about white men, we're talking about men of color, and you can see that, just even as men of color still overwhelmingly support Harris, that support is lower than it was 4 years ago for Biden. And that's why we're seeing appeals, instead of to women to vote for Democrats, we're seeing appeals to men to vote for Democrats to protect the women in their lives. So I'm thinking specifically about Michelle Obama's speech the other night, where she was, imploring men to protect their moms, their wives, their girlfriends, et cetera, from Trump. And so the gender dynamics of this election in some ways look similar to other elections, but in some ways look very different. And it'll be interesting to get the final exit polls to really dissect the gender gap.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, a lot of what we're talking about now is about what the polls look like, and the polls can be wrong, of course. So right now it looks like Trump is gaining a little bit with non-white voters, that he is doing better with men than he did in 2020, but that could all be wrong when we actually see who votes and have post-election data. Yeah, advertisements. So the political science literature it suggests that ads matter a little bit, and that ads matter a lot more in lower down ballot races than in presidential races. And this makes sense, of course. Even politically unengaged voters have probably thought a little bit about the presidential race at this point. How many people know who they're voting for state legislature right now? The name of the candidate? Okay, well, this is, yeah. So even in a very politically engaged audience here, we only had about half the hands go up. I will admit, I actually don't know who my state representative is, and that's embarrassing for me professionally. But so if you think about that, it makes sense then that a political ad that talks about one of these races that people haven't thought of a whole lot, that can have a bigger impact than political ads at the presidential level. And the other thing I say, the political science research, again, the sort of best research we have right now suggests that there is a small impact of political ads at the presidential level. So when you have a big imbalance in spending, like we saw in 2016, for example, and now, I think maybe not quite as extreme, but now that can have a little bit of an impact around the margins. Other research, though, shows that we're extremely bad, both political scientists and campaign operatives, at predicting which ads work. So there's this really great paper that looks at internal message testing data that a Democratic firm did across hundreds of ads. And basically, none of the theories that we have about what makes campaign ads work or not work find consistent support across different ads. So there's an old quote in advertising, not political advertising, that half of my ad budget is wasted. I just don't know which half. And I think that's definitely true of political ads as well.
Thanks, Dan. Since you don't know who your state rep is, we're not going to let you answer any more questions. This is a question for Mark. We've had a couple of people asking about Trump's economic policy proposals, specifically tariff policy, and what do you think the impact of that would be on U.S.-Chinese relations and how those might shake out if he were to be elected?
So I think there's sort of two levels on which this might play out. One is in terms of the effect it would have on the U.S. economy, right? So it's very hard to know exactly what Trump would do with respect to tariffs, right? Some of the more extreme things he's said, 20% tariff on everything coming into the country. Well, the effect of that would be to massively spike inflation in the United States, would be to substantially reduce economic growth in the United States, at least in the short term. If you're the Chinese government, that sounds pretty great, I would have thought. So there's that. So there's the effect it would have on the U.S. economy and what consequences that might have for the U.S.-China relationship. Then there's the effect in terms of the bilateral relationship. And here, I think it's a little hard to say, but certainly Trump's first term represented a fundamental shift in US policy, right? You suddenly had a bunch of tariffs placed and you had an escalating trade war, which for the most part worked to China's advantage if you look at at sort of the geopolitical consequences of it. The Biden administration, though, has largely continued at least a large number of those tariffs. So we're sort of now in this new normal, I think, where the US-China relationship is just characterized by some amount of trade conflict. And so to that extent, whether Trump would engage in a massive escalation of that, I think is a little hard to say, and therefore exactly what the consequences for the US-China relationship moving forward is also fairly hard to say.
All right, so shifting gears entirely, I want to return to the question of polling, right? We're all following the polls with bated breath and tracking every little change. And so one question has to do with the science of polling, and are we getting things right? And so this question asks in sort of two different ways. One, are we underestimating Trump voters and Trump support? Are the models taking account of that appropriately? It was a question that was raised in 2016 and 2020. And then specifically for Michael, what about polling and sort of whether or not it reflects the diversity of the electorate? Is that a challenge that pollsters have risen to, or are they also undercounting other populations?
Polling has gotten much more difficult as everyone knows. No one answers their phone for random numbers anymore, so pollsters have tried to do a bunch of things to account for this. And the basic thing that pollsters do is they take the responses they get, and they know the demographic characteristics and sometimes the political attitudes or characteristics of the people who actually responded to their poll. And then they reweigh the poll, and all that means is assigning more weight to some responses so that the weighed responses that come out the other side reflect what they think the electorate will look like. So if you have a really hard time reaching 18 to 29-year-old voters, then you might sort of double count the 18 to 29-year-olds who actually respond to your poll in order to get the correct proportion of 18 to 29-year-olds in the electorate. So this has been a problem with Trump voters. It has been a different problem in each election cycle. In 2016, it was a problem because pollsters didn't weigh as much on education. Education wasn't a demographic that predicted how people voted until 2016. And so they had a lot of Republicans in their sample who were highly educated and were defecting from Trump. And so that's why sort of they underestimated Clinton. In 2020, Democrats were more likely to pick up the phone than Republicans, and people who were worried about COVID were more likely to pick up the phone because they were at home. And so that is sort of the leading theory for why the 2020 polls were off. If I knew which direction the 2024 polls would be off, I wouldn't be here. I would be betting a lot of money on the markets right now. And so pollsters have tried to correct these things, but we really won't know until next Tuesday or even beyond whether they were successful. I think it is worth recognizing, though, that as we move further and further from a world where people answer their phone and answer polls, what you're seeing with a poll is much more the modeling decisions made by the pollster and less the sort of randomly sampled respondents that sort of are in the ideal version of a political poll.
Yeah, Dan said like the non-response rate is really a big problem with pollsters. Everyone has caller ID. Heck, I don't answer the phone unless I know the number, and I imagine many of you are like that. And so if you don't know who the number is, and so it's really hard to reach those populations that you need. So and so when you talk about underrepresented groups like Blacks, Latinos, white working class too. I mean, those are hard voters to reach for pollsters. And then especially right now, if you're one of these swing states and you're getting a call every minute. So so you're maybe not getting the type of sample that you want. And then some of these polls, they really rely on when you look at some of the numbers, for African Americans and Latinos. I mean, a lot of these polls don't spend the money in terms of oversampling. Sometimes they have a low number of African Americans, a low number of Latinos. And when you have those small numbers, it's hard to make these guesses about how they're going to vote and what their vote choices and their vote preferences. But these large polling, taking pre-election polls are very expensive, and so a lot of these big pollsters are like, it's not worth it to try to spend money to oversample to get a true gauge. Now, there's some firms out there that do oversample for African Americans and Latinos, and a lot of their polling is actually consistent with past vote counts where blacks, Latinos are overwhelmingly voting for the Democratic candidate. Now, again, we won't know until the actual election's over with, but again, I'm skeptical when I see polling that says 20% of blacks are voting for the Republican candidate at the presidential level, and you should be skeptical too.
Great.
I would just add, it is actually kind of remarkable that polls are still as accurate as they are given the kind of non-response that pollsters deal with. So, nothing we said was ragging on pollsters. But if you look for very high-quality polls that do have oversampling of groups that they're trying to focus on, so organizations like Pew, sometimes the New York Times when it aggregates across a bunch of surveys, those would be a little more reliable potentially.
Great. So I want to shift gears. We've had this election described as a nail biter, at a coin flip. Nobody really knows what's going to happen. So I want to ask, the first question goes to anyone really, like, what do you expect to actually see on election night, and how much do you expect we'll know if and when we actually go to sleep on election night? And then I want to talk a little bit about the aftermath. And so this is a question particularly for Tim. How prepared is the judicial system for the relative onslaught of lawsuits that are very likely to be filed, particularly in the swing states? And I guess sort of more generally, what might the aftermath of this election look like?
I will start with election night, because that's the easiest part to answer. I will start with election night, because that's the easiest part to answer, and that is that I think it is highly unlikely that we will know who has won the presidency on election night. If you remember back 4 years ago, we found out on a Saturday morning. Now, clues were beginning to point as the votes were continuing to be counted that Biden was gaining steam and would likely win, but we did not know the winner until the Saturday after election, and with 7 swing states, and some of them that have state laws that stipulate that absentee ballots can't be counted until the polls close on election night, like Pennsylvania with its 19 electoral college votes. I just think it is, unless the election, all the swing states go in the same direction, which polls don't suggest that's going to happen, I think it's unlikely we'll know on election night. We could know the results of the U.S. Senate. I think it's unlikely we'll know the results of the U.S. House either. That took a while 4 years ago as well. And so I will pass the microphone for the rest of the question.
Yeah, I would agree, and particularly when watching poll results, it's important to know that different states count votes in different orders at different times, and so sort of the provisional results you see across the night are often not terribly indicative of what the final results are going to be. If you can, you should probably just vote and then go to sleep, and
I was just going to say, I really hope that it's not a 2000 Bush v. Gore. So, Tim.
It's a good segue, Michael. Look, I actually think the federal courts are probably well set up for this. One, because both parties or both presidential campaigns are set up in the 7 states as well as in other states that they think may be contested. So there are lawyers on the ground who are preparing arguments, and those arguments really do have an effect on how courts decide all the way down, in some respect, to the district court level. The other reason that I think the courts are probably prepared is that the federal courts all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court showed no appetite in 2020 to get involved in these cases, and in particular the cases where there were claims of voter fraud. Now, of course, they may get involved to the extent of recounts, but all states have triggers for when recounts kick into action, so you don't really need judicial oversight for those recounts. I do think that the cases will come fast and furious into federal court. I think most of them are going to be shot down relatively quickly. Now, you might say, well, the court has a 6-person majority that has gotten more and more ideologically extreme. Well, that was true in 2020 as well. Remember that Ruth Bader Ginsburg's replacement was put on the bench a week before the election, and so there was that 6-person majority in place there, and the Supreme Court then did not want to get involved and was unwilling to take any except a very minuscule case, which I don't remember what the issue even was, on Mr. Trump's claims about election fraud or irregularities. So I think that in the end, we're going to see lots of lawsuits, probably one way or the other. I think they're most likely going to go nowhere, although it will keep people in suspense for some time. The question is how long.
So you can see I said Dan couldn't answer questions, and now
So
he's answered every question. So
I
you
know.
can see how things work in the Department of Political Science with a very authoritative chair.
We're not an authoritarian government here, apparently. I do think, continuing on what Tim said, we should expect if Donald Trump loses or if it's extremely close that we will see the same kinds of, the rhetoric is exactly the same as it was in 2020 regarding questioning the electoral results and trying to file a bunch of lawsuits and to raise questions about the results. And J.D. Vance takes a different position on the 2020 election than Mike Pence did. And so I think we should expect to see a replay of that if it is a Harris victory and it's not a landslide.
And just to add that December 17th is sort of the date to watch in the states. We think of January 6th as obviously a date that we will never forget, the day that Congress certifies the Electoral College vote, but December 17th is when electors meet in each state. And so that is a date to keep on your radar screen.
Okay, great. So we've had a few questions actually about one sort of demographic that didn't get a lot of attention during the presentation, so I'm not sure who is best to answer this one, but young voters and sort of their role in this election. And I think coming at it in a few different ways, sort of generally, what is the role of age? What's the role of generational differences among voters? Sort of what do we know and what do you expect in 2024? And then given each campaign's use of social media, is that having any sort of an impact on young voters and their engagement in politics?
I'm sure others will weigh in as well, but just briefly, young voters are the least likely cohort to vote. Young voters are the most residentially mobile, and in many states you have to register, well before Election Day, and even if not, you don't know where your new precinct is. Young voters are, they often have lower incomes, they're often sort of working different jobs, and they're not accustomed to voting. And so young voters, given that in election after election, are sort of the cohort that votes least regularly, sometimes they get the least amount of attention from campaigns. That does not appear to be the case in 2024 with social media attempts to mobilize young voters. And it is also the case that this particular cohort of young voters, when they voted in 2020, was more Democratic in the sense that they voted for Joe Biden at a higher rate than previous cohorts of young voters had voted for the Democratic candidate. So Democratic candidates recognize that young voters, if they can be mobilized, are a really, really important part of Democrats' coalition. Republicans also recognize this, and so we're trying to take support away from Democratic candidates, especially among Republican men without college degrees.
I think it really, as Kathryn said, usually younger people between 18 to 24, they usually have a lower voter turnout than other groups. But I think it varies by if you live in a swing state, right? So, Democrats and Republicans are mobilizing low propensity voters. They think they have a shot. I mean, they want their base, but they also know they can't just win the election on their base alone. So, and I think that's why the Democrats were so worried when Biden had the debate and he didn't do what people thought he was gonna do. And I was like, why are you surprised? He's older, yes. That's what older people do. Oh my God, Democrat, oh, he has to leave. And so by Biden stepping aside, many Democrats hope that he energize younger people. And I think there is some polling to show that younger people are energized because Biden is on the campaign, that Biden steps aside and that Harris is now the nominee. And I think we'll see that. If we're gonna see evidence of that, we're gonna see it in the swing states. You know, social media, yeah, younger people, I mean, I have teenagers and and even our college students, they communicate in ways we don't. I mean, I hear older people on Facebook, we're on TikTok and Snapchat, and some of my students I was talking to, they say they don't even watch TV. So I think the campaigns have invested a lot of money to make sure that they have the messaging just right for the different demographic groups, and the campaigns are very, very good at this. So I think they'll make a choice.
Just to keep my streak alive. I'm not going to disagree with what either of my colleagues said, but I'll just say that one implication of this, and especially what Michael said, is that younger voters in your life, those are the people who are attending a pre-election panel and are almost certainly going to vote. Those are the people who you can have a real impact with. Getting into an argument with your older aunt and uncle, probably not going to have a big impact. But talking to the younger voters in your life, and I'm looking especially at the younger people in the audience, particularly the younger people who are disengaged from politics. So think about who are your friends or your relatives who are younger and who are the least engaged in politics. Those are the people who you can really have an impact with.
Great. So this is a question for Kathryn about the glass ceiling. Hypothetically, do you think that Vice President Harris has made gains toward breaking the glass ceiling, even if ultimately the coin flip doesn't go her way next week? Or alternatively, do you think that Harris' loss would be a sort of a long-term setback for a possibility of a female president?
I think we could find some evidence in both directions, but I think the bottom line is that it would be a long-term gain. There is a political science literature on the role model effect that talks about the ways in which sort of young adolescent girls and teens who are sort of entering a moment of political socialization view political figures, and the role model effect actually increases interest, it increases knowledge, and has many positive effects. So I think that the effect for women, for young girls of color in particular, of Harris at the top of the ticket will be positive in terms of both political information and motivation to run for office, perhaps among a very small subset, but certainly to be interested and engaged in politics. One key difference between Clinton and Harris is that in the 2016 presidential race, Clinton talked about breaking barriers and being the first woman a lot. Harris has not talked about that. Others have talked about that. So they have taken a different sort of approach and style, but I think that sort of win or lose, she has shown many young women in particular across the country what is possible, and that will be a positive. Even as she's faced, obviously criticism and backlash and things that, may turn some people off from politics.
And I study political representation a lot, and so you can't be it if you don't see it. And I think that you can say, oh, a woman can be president, oh, you can do it, but if you see it, then you can believe it and you know that you can be it. And I know that Kamala Harris, if she wins, it's going to be a big impact on all women, girls. They're going to look at, whether you're Republican, Democrat, Independent, it's going to be something to see a woman who's commander-in-chief. It's going to be a big change in how we see who can, most people, we heard black jobs, like taking black jobs, and then someone said, Democrats like, oh, the presidency is the black job, but most people think commander-in-chief, that's a man's job. Well, if Kamala Harris becomes president, is it a man's job still, right? And she does have a heavy weight and a heavy burden, right? So saying that she does win. Everyone's looking at her every move. They're gonna judge, she has to project strength. You hear some of the things like, I don't know if she's gonna be able to deal with Putin or deal with, all these other leaders. And I'm like, well, yeah, Trump did a really good job handling with these guys. So, I mean, some of these things are just so ridiculous. So I think it's gonna be a big step in terms of just showing that role model that women can do it, they can be commander-in-chief, they can be the head of the bureaucracy, and I think she will, if she wins, she will be the first, and I guarantee you she won't be the last.
Okay, great. So I think in closing, I'd like to ask a pretty broad question and maybe get responses from all of the panelists. There have been several different contributions from our audience that are about the state of American democracy. Most of them expressing pretty great concern about how things are working in the 21st century United States. And so I'll just throw out a few different types of questions and pick one or two and choose your own adventure. So how can citizens protect and strengthen democracy in a more consistent way? Something that goes beyond the heat of a single election campaign. Is there something that ordinary citizens should do? Or an institutional type of question, what parts of our political infrastructure need to change in order for American democracy to be strengthened? And what needs to happen for there to be a greater possibility of bipartisanship, or at least an acknowledgement of the same reality? And so thinking through some of those questions, the issues of political trust, issues of legitimacy, what do you see going forward as some of these really big questions about American democracy and its ability to function?
So I'll talk a little bit about the foreign policy consequences of this, because I think it actually is one of the key challenges that the United States as a nation is going to face in terms of its international politics moving forward. And the problem is that to the extent that the United States is so polarized, and to the extent that that polarization has huge consequences for foreign policy, it basically makes the United States as a nation incapable of making an agreement that other countries can trust beyond a single election cycle. And this has enormous consequences for the United States' ability to sustain alliances, to make deals. If you think about things like the Iran nuclear deal, other deals with other countries who might be interested in acquiring nuclear weapons as the United States' power declines. If you think about potential deals with Russia on the future of arms control, or China with respect to trade, to the extent that the American political system is so polarized, that has a huge dampening effect on the ability of the United States to achieve its foreign policy goals moving forward. And I think this is one of the primary sort of international challenges that the United States is going to have to deal with moving forward.
So as a court scholar, this probably isn't a question for me, but I'll answer it in a different way than a court scholar, and that is as a political scientist who is a citizen in the United States. In terms of Andy's first question, how to maybe drive down polarization outside of this one election, as well as, I think, your third question, which is related. I would say two things, right, on a normative level. One is actually get involved on a local level, because that's where you can effectuate the most policy, whether it's in your city or your county. That you're going to be upset whether it's a Trump or a Harris victory. There's going to be half the population or close to that who's going to be very upset. On your day-to-day life, yes, depending on who wins, there's going to be an impact. But the real impact is if you get involved at the local level, you get involved in the local elections, you get involved in volunteering locally, and then you start talking to people and find out whether they have similar views to you. I know that Dan does all sorts of research on people talking to one another in small group environments, and get off your damn computers and social media. And that is actually talking to one another. And I will tell you that my spouse and I have a whole cadre of friends who do not have the exact same political beliefs than us, and in fact, a fair number of friends who have pretty diametrically opposed political beliefs than we do, but we can talk about issues like you used to be able to do when I was coming of age in the late 70s into the 80s and into the early 90s, but we don't talk to one another anymore. And the way to diffuse so many of the problems we have today is actually to start not only talking, but probably more importantly, listening. And get off your computers.
You know, polarization is a big question. I mean, in a lot of ways, I mean, our political system is this adversarial system, right? Where the parties, where we've organized into these big parties, Democrats, Republicans, and they're fighting for power. And they need issues in order to distinguish themselves from one another. So we've made great strides over the years in terms of what we've done. And many people would like to think that our country is less civil than it was, say, in the 1860s when we had a civil war, or when candidates used to have duels, and when they used to cane people. And so, I mean, we really need to know our history, right? And then if we know our history, we know we've made a lot of advances over time. I mean, we still have more challenges. And I think that, you know, the one thing, and I said it in my presentation, I do worry about the dependence on political parties on these big donors. I mean, you have Tim Mellon, who donated over $115 million to a Republican candidate. Then Marianne Adelson, again, 100 some odd million. Michael Bloomberg, what, just only 40-something million to the Democrats. So who are the parties responsive to? And are these donors, now if these donors are representative of all citizens, then we might say, well, yeah, maybe that's not that big a deal because they think like most of us. But we all know that many of the donors, many people in these organizations, they're either way more liberal, way more conservative than the average American. And so when you put all of that together and you got parties that are fighting for power, it makes it very difficult to really look at all the things where we have more in common than we have. And I strongly believe this, we have more in common than we have our differences. And you don't realize how American you are until you leave the country. You really don't. And so, but I think this party is the way to, if we can try to get money out of politics, or at least try to have some type of campaign finance reform, I think that really can start changing how our leaders and who they, not only who our leaders respond to, but even the selection of our leaders, because our elections are very expensive and they need a lot of money, so they usually go to the people that have a lot of money. Oh, and then one last thing, on a positive note, I do think that like young people, the one thing that's been inspiring to me to see, I've seen high school students who don't yet have the right to vote. They're out there organizing. You know, they're taking people to the polls. They're giving out candidate information. So even if you even if you can't vote yet, you can still be involved in civic organizations that can talk about the issues and can advocate for the candidates, so.
Yeah, so I'll maybe qualify slightly some of the things that my colleagues have said. I think getting involved is good. I think it's important to get involved in the right way. And I think that one thing that often happens when people get involved in politics, get deeply involved in politics, is that they develop more of an identification with a a political party or with a candidate or with a president, and that can sometimes be a barrier to seeing commonality. So I do think we have seen in this age of increased polarization, we've seen record voter turnout, and part of me thinks that's great, but part of me thinks, well, that doesn't seem to be correlated with good things happening in politics. So I think being involved in politics is great, but you want to try to do it in a way that does not lead to caricaturing the other side or lead to putting yourself in an ideological silo where you can't comprehend how people could support the other side. I mean, I live in a more blue ideological silo. People ask me all the time, how could anybody vote for Trump? And I say, well, somewhere between 45 and 50% of Americans are going to vote for Trump. So there's a lot of them. You should go talk to them and figure that out. If you view that as inconceivable, then that's a problem. That's a real serious problem. So I think getting involved in the local level, maybe particularly if you can get involved in local political parties. Maybe I'll give a little nudge to, if you're a moderate Republican out there who doesn't like the Republican Party anymore, go take that party back. You can do something about that. If you're a Democrat who doesn't like the way that politics has gotten so vitriolic, you can get involved in your local party and try to turn it in a little bit of a different way. And I do think also, changes in media are really underrated, I think. I study this, so I of course think this is really important. Go read a local newspaper or read a local newspaper website. Go support journalism that's happening in your local community. Get acquainted with issues at the local level and support that work and try to spread that work among your social circle. And I'll second what Tim said. Get offline. The social media business model is very simple. It is trying to keep you glued to the screen as long as possible, and we know as political psychologists that the thing that does that is sparking anxiety and anger and other strong negative emotions. And so that's what your social media feed, whether it's TikTok or Twitter or X or whatever, that's what that feed is optimized to do. And so if that's how you're getting political information, you're just going to be fed a stream of things that are going to make you very angry and hate the other side.
Thank you. A lot of pressure being the last. I won't repeat any of the great insight that my colleague said, but one thing that gives me hope is the fact that in 2022, there was a lot of concern about election deniers winning, election deniers losing and then causing violence. And for the most part, the 2022 midterms were pretty smooth when it came to, a lot of election deniers lost and those who did not cause violence. But thinking about January 6th still gives me pause. And so I really share the concerns of the questioners. And, I'll be nervous on December 17th. I'll be nervous on January 6th. But, election administration itself worked well in 2020. Sort of the election administration guardrails held. The court cases, were fairly adjudicated when it came to the election results, but it is troubling that there are candidates who say that they will not necessarily respect the results of legitimate elections, and so I think to some extent we'll need to wait and see. But long term, our democracy is going to depend not just on sort of citizen engagement and involvement, as my colleagues have talked about, but also on leaders who take democracy seriously and even as partisans also put American democracy first.
Great. And with that, we're out of time, so I want to thank my 5 colleagues for their contributions to tonight's discussion. I also want to thank our hosts here at the Humphreys School for welcoming us and making things work. And I want to send a special note of thanks to our outstanding staff who have sacrificed their evening to listen to faculty for 2 more hours than they usually do. So thanks, Alexis, Corey, Caitlin, Sophia, and Peyton. And finally, last but not least, I want to thank the audience, both our in-person audience here who's contributed the note cards and our online audience for joining us, for asking very thoughtful and engaging questions and really generating a very nice discussion. So good night, everyone, and thanks again for taking the time to join us this evening.